Hey there, I'm Jackie Ferris. This week on the 302, we are in historic Odessa, checking out the Wilson Warner House, a prime example of extreme wealth and extreme loss documented for historians and visitors centuries later. Get ready to take a deep dive into history. The 302 is headed your way. We are at the oldest operating house museum, the Wilson Warner House, which is a delight to walk through. And we're going to learn a lot about the history behind the house. We're joined now by Debbie Buxton with Historic Odessa. Debbie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for coming. We're thrilled to have you.
Well, we appreciate it. Every time we come to Odessa, it's a good time, that's for sure. So let's talk a little bit about this house. It's very significant in the fact that it is the oldest, right?
Correct, it is. It was built in 1769 by David Wilson Sr. and eventually was inherited by his son, David Wilson Jr. David Wilson Jr. in the 1820s makes some poor business decisions and basically loses everything he has. And the house today is furnished according to an 1828 bankruptcy list of sale because everything was sold at public auction to settle his debts. Interestingly enough, the auction document is in our collection. So we have that ledger that listed everything that was sold from every room the day of the sale and who purchased it and how much they paid for it. So it's a wonderful, wonderful interpretive document for the museum. And today the house is furnished according to that 1828 bankruptcy list of sale.
Now, I know throughout time some family members tried to reassemble some of the pieces, and Historic Odessa has tried to do the same. Tell me the story about, the family members just trying to, create this shrine to their family.
Well, it begins really with Mary Warner. Mary Warner was the granddaughter of David Wilson Sr. and the great-granddaughter of their neighbor and family by marriage, William Corbett. So there was a very strong familial connection. When this house came back on the market in 1920, Mary Warner, Mrs. E. Tatnall Warner, purchased the house and brought it back into the Wilson family. And she begins collecting Wilson memorabilia for the house. But of course, because everything was sold at public auction, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. So you don't have nearly the number of objects that belong to the immediate family that we have with our Corbett Sharp house. However, we do have some wonderful things that illustrate what the family's life was like in 1828. And at the time, the current Mrs. Wilson had everything styled at the highest level of fashion for the period. So Mary Warner brings it back into the family in 1920. When she dies, she leaves it in a trust called David Wilson Mansion Incorporated. And her descendants operate it and open it to the public in 1924. And it is today the oldest operating house museum in Delaware.
So let's talk about some of those original objects and some of the objects that were similar to those that would be in the house. Got to start with the tea set.
Oh, the tea set is wonderful. The tea set belonged to Anne Jeffers, who was David Wilson's first wife. And at the bankruptcy sale, it's put up for auction. It's purchased by her mother, Deborah Jeffers. Deborah Jeffers comes back, she buys it at the sale, and it's probably the only reason that we have it today. So we feel very fortunate. It's a beautiful, beautiful silver tea service, and the English transferware on the table also belonged to Anne Jeffers.
So it's perfect to be in here. This would have been the parlor where you would receive your guests and everything. And looking over any tea party that you might have, the person who built the house.
Correct. No,
the son of the person.
That's the son of the person who built the house. That's David Wilson Jr. And a portrait of him in his old age. After the bankruptcy, the Wilson family moves from Odessa to Philadelphia for a short period of time where he does an apprenticeship as a brush maker. And then they moved to a Quaker community in Indiana. Unfortunately, they never regained their wealth. We follow the two families pretty closely because they're related by marriage, so there are letters and records and things that go back and forth between Indiana and Odessa. And often his wife is writing and asking the family to send her fabric to make shirts and things. So that piece of it is a little bit sad. But at the time that they lived in Odessa, he was probably the wealthiest man in town next to William Corbett.
So tell me about this carpet.
Well, the day of the bankruptcy sale, there were only 3 things sold from the parlor. We think that the parlor furniture was the only thing that they took with them when they left Odessa. The carpet this one is a reproduction Brussels carpet, but very similar to the one that would have been here in 1828 when the bankruptcy occurred. And again, this ingrain carpet is the height of fashion in 1828. So up until the point that they lose everything, they really had a very glamorous life for Odessa.
And it all kind of coordinates. I see that there's also 2 needle points.
Correct.
On the walls. Are those original or?
Those are original. Those were worked by Ann Jeffers, David Wilson Jr.'s first wife. And she was a very, very accomplished needleworker. They're really quite beautiful. But what's really fun, I think, is that when we did a paint analysis of the house to determine the original color of all the paints, the paint scientist came into an empty building, took her samples, and when we were refurnishing the house and we hung the needlework, we realized that all the colors in Ann Jeffers' needlework are really the color palette of the interior paints. So clearly she had a preference for these colors.
Absolutely, and I would imagine that that was the thing that you did back in the day. You created needleworks for your home to make it like a personal touch?
Oh yes, absolutely, and especially young women were very adept at needlework by the time they were about 12 years old. They're finishing their samplers. But she was extraordinary. Her needlework is really excellent, which is a sign of her education and her status.
Now, I can't wait to see the rest of the house, and we're going to do that when we come back.
Hi, I'm Nancy Alexander. I'm the director of the Rehoboth Beach Museum in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. And I had a blast today sharing our city's history with the 302.
Welcome back. We have moved from the parlor into the dining room. And Debbie, you really get a sense of what it was like back in the day when they would sit down, at their table. The chairs really speak to us. They're gorgeous. Tell us a little bit about them.
Well, the day of the bankruptcy sale, there were over 100 side chairs sold from the house. Just to give you an idea about the enormous wealth that these people had. But they also had numerous sets of painted fancy chairs. And in 1828, these would have been the height of fashion. These particular fancy chairs are a set of 8 Philadelphia-style painted fancy chairs, and they have beautifully painted fruit baskets, very similar to the fruit basket that you see on the center of the table.
So is that gold leaf or just gold paint, or?
It's a gold paint that's sort of like gold leaf. It would have been very vibrant in 1828.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, talk to us a little bit about the dishes that we see.
Well, again, pages and pages of ceramics were sold. I mean, the enormity of the wealth that they lost is really pretty incredible. So we have this wonderful set of creamware that belongs to our collection, and it's a huge set of creamware with numerous pieces, and well over 100 pieces, and numerous tureens. It's quite showy. So we have it here in the cabinets to give you a sense of the enormity of the wealth that this family had and the level of material objects that they possessed. I mean, it's extraordinary. And it looks great with the green paint.
So when you talk about just the loss of all of this, being such a prominent family, being connected by marriage to another prominent family, in the records, is there any indication that, the lady of the house was just distraught by losing her things?
Well, there's not a lot. They were Quaker, they were reserved. There's no real complaining about it, except that when she writes home, after they leave Odessa and they move to Indiana, you get a definite sense that her life is not easy, and that it's much harder, and a sense of possible regret there. But they're really quite reserved in their, emotionally about it. Although you get a sense that David Wilson Jr. was a scholar and a very highly educated man. His list of books, for instance, the books that he owned, is extraordinary. He had an extraordinary library, and he owned a microscope. He must have been the only guy in Lower Newcastle County with a microscope in 1828. So, interesting family.
So there are so many unique objects here. Tell us a little bit about the boxes that we have over here on the divan.
Well, they're quite interesting because those are American knife boxes, which is very rare. I mean, you see lots of English knife boxes, but it's a set of American knife boxes is rare. And the wood, the interior woods, are Tula poplar, which actually puts them in this region. That's an indigenous wood to the region. They belong to Mary Warner. We don't know how she connects them to the family. That's a mystery and will always remain so. But they were probably locally made. There's a strong possibility that they could have been made in Odessa by John Janvier, the local cabinet maker.
So tell us about the portrait just above them.
The portrait is of Mary Warner, Mrs. E. Tatnall Warner, and she really is responsible for the first efforts of historic preservation of this house. I mean, she has a strong familial feeling towards it, and when it comes up for sale, she's the one who really puts it together.
Now, did she write anything, like does she have diaries, or do you have documents where she takes you through the process of, oh, today I bought XYZ, it belonged to my family and I'm going to put it in the house, anything like that?
Well, we don't have diaries, but what she did do was label everything. So there are labels on many of the artifacts that belong to the family with a little history written in her hand. If it's a textile, it's often sewed to whatever the textile is. On the furniture, she put little brass plaques that gave some background information about the furniture. So she was big on leaving little hints of where things came from, and they are more or less accurate.
Yeah. So she was really interested in making sure that her family's legacy could be shared by generations to come.
Well, as was her father. Her father, Daniel Corbett, was really responsible for pulling together the family papers and the family furniture at the Corbett Sharp House. So, she definitely comes by that naturally.
So before we leave this room, I have to ask you about the high chair.
Oh, the high chair I love. It's one of my favorite things in the entire collection. It's a little high chair that was made in Delaware City, which is just north of us.
That's really cool. So did it have a piece that went across the top, or how did you use it?
They just scoot them up to the table.
Oh, that's amazing.
So it puts the child at table level. I don't know how safe it was, but they would just scoot them right up to the table.
And the mirror that we have right here, that is really amazing with is that an eagle
That's
at the top?
Phoenix.
A phoenix.
That's a phoenix, yes.
Tell me about this. Is this part of their collection?
It is not. It is part of the collection of the Historic Odessa Foundation, and it represents the mirror that would have been hanging in this room. So we can tell from the ledger how much people paid for things, about what type of mirror would have been here. And clearly, this is a high-style mirror with gilt.
And the phoenix is kind of emblematic.
It's emblematic.
Yeah,
yes.
Especially with the family, because it took so long for them to pay off these. They had the money, but it took forever.
7 years.
Yeah.
So when he goes into bankruptcy, or assignment, as it was known in the early 19th century, he assigns everything to his close personal friends and relatives, and they're responsible for collecting all of his debt. Now, he was a merchant, so he had a lot of credit extended, and in those days, your handshake was your bond. It was as good as a contract. So when his debts were called, when the margins were called against the investments that he'd made in the wheat market, he needed to collect all the money that he had out there extended on credit. It took 7 years to settle the debt.
That's amazing. I can't wait to see what you're going to show us next, and we'll be right back to check it out.
Hi, Heidi Benson here, artist teacher at the Center for Creative Arts, inspiring your creative journey here on the 302.
Welcome back. We've moved from the dining room into the kitchen, and Debbie, this is really an amazing example of a kitchen back in the day. Talk to us a little bit about, especially, you know, the cooking area.
Well, this is pretty typical of an 18th century kitchen in a wealthy household. And what's particularly fascinating about our kitchen is that while in a wealthy household you would find a beehive oven, you don't often see two. So this is a double oven. You know, we have double wall ovens. This has a double beehive oven, which means they were producing a lot of baked goods out of this kitchen.
So basically, it's just kind of like a cubby hole where they would put fire on both sides, right?
Correct. Well, it's called a beehive oven because it's shaped like a beehive. And the oven itself is in an oven house on the outside of the building with the openings here in the kitchen. And they would build the fire up in the center of the beehive oven and get it really good and hot. You want a beehive oven to get up to, you know, 500, 600, 700 degrees. And then you scrape the coals out, and the oven walls are hot, and you put in your baked goods, your bread or pies or whatever you're baking. The things that take the longest go in first, because slowly the oven begins to lose temperature over time. So you're going to cook the things that need the highest temperature first, and then as the oven is cooling, you're going to put the things in that take a little less of a high temperature. So if you're starting, say, at 475, and you're putting things in at that level, and then as it comes down, you're putting your pies in at 350. Of course, they didn't know what the temperature was.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. I guess it must have taken a little bit of trial and error to figure out how long to cook certain things.
It was practice. It was practice, and the more you did it, the better you were at it. And you employed all of your senses. So you were watching what you were cooking, and you were listening to what you were cooking, and you were smelling what you were cooking. So that kept you attuned to what was happening in the oven. And they had to move things around because the temperature wasn't consistent all over the oven. So if you had bread in, you were shuffling it around as it was baking so that it baked evenly. So it took a little work and it took a little practice.
Absolutely. Well, how would they utilize the space in the front for like soups and stews and roasts and things? How would they do that?
Well, if you're stewing something, it's in a kettle and is never really over the direct fire. These fireplaces get really, really hot, and you're going to see more of that later in your next segment, right? Later in your visit. But it's called hearth cooking because it actually happens on the hearth. They take out the coals and they create little burners all over the hearth. And you had to think about your cooking too. You had to think about where things were placed.
And the timing of it, I can just imagine.
Right.
You know, thank goodness for the microwave.
Well, cooking was oral tradition, so it was handed down from person to person. Men and women needed to know how to cook. Everybody needed to know how to bake bread.
Yeah. Now, one of the things when you come in, you notice the ovens and everything, but you also notice there's a bed in the corner.
Well, there is. And the day of the bankruptcy sale, there was a bed sold, a cot sold from the kitchen. And that's a wonderful early 19th century camp bed that we have pictured in this room. And yeah, you would have a servant that could be sleeping in the room. And remember that you want to keep those fires going too. At night they would bank the fires. That was an important thing, to watch your fire and be sure that you had enough hot coals to get it going the next day. Trust me, you don't want to try to start a fire with flint and steel on a rainy day. It's not easy.
And because the family were Quakers, this would have been a free person that they employed that slept.
Most likely, yes. By 1828, David Wilson's first wife, Ann Jeffers, had very, very strong Quaker values, and so in this household they were abolitionists.
I can imagine you need somebody who can really keep track of everything because there's so many, metal plates and earthen plates and what they're used for and everything. How do you recreate something like this? Because it really feels like you could walk in and you could start cooking.
Well, we're very fortunate here at the Historic Odessa Foundation because we have some of the best documented buildings around, really, in Delaware, but even beyond Delaware. So we have historic documentation, we study it, we read it, and it gives us a lot of information about what life was like. When you look at the bankruptcy list of sale, it lists everything that was sold in the room. So we can pull together objects that are similar, and we know by how much people paid for them about what level of object that was, sort of the difference between an all-clad cooking pot and Corningware.
Absolutely. So, you know, our show is very brief, and I know people just get glimpses of things, but if they want to come and they want to check out, you know, and just kind of marvel in the history, what do they need to do in order to come and see this for themselves?
Well, the Historic Odessa Foundation is open Tuesday through Saturday from 10 until 4, with our last full tour at 3 o'clock. They are guided tours. You can purchase a ticket at our visitor center, and our very knowledgeable guides will be happy to take you through all the buildings and talk to you at length about everything that we have. We have a marvelous collection, over 7,000 objects.
So it's
most of them from the region, so it's a strong regional collection.
And the beauty of it is you have several places that you could go to. You could spend a whole day here, go get a burger at Cantwell's in between one house or another, and just have a great day. Debbie, thank you so much for
Thank you.
sharing.
Thank you so much for having us, for coming.
You bet. We'll be right back. For more information on the Wilson Warner House, you can visit historicodessa.org. That'll do it for this week's episode of the 302. We're going to leave you with some beauty shots from historic Odessa Gardens. Until next time, I'm Jackie Ferris. Tell them you saw it on the 302.